background, first of all. I come from a background of market research and strategy. So over the last 20 years, I've set up, run, bought, sold various agencies that are essentially focused on helping big companies market themselves and communicate better. Now, after I left my last company, I hooked up with Andrew Jevons, so I think many of you know, my business partner. And we have a shared interest in something called semiotics. And that is the main focus of what this business does in terms of deploying technology. Does anybody know what semiotics is? Apart from Andrew. Go. It is very much so. It's very much so. I'll give you an example. So if we consider a wasp, okay, what you would say is that the sign is the wasp. It is a wasp. It exists. It's an insect. But the thing that it communicates or signifies to human beings is perhaps something deeper. What could that be? Fear, danger, all of those good things. And that's why black and yellow tape is so common, right, as a signifier of warning. So that's a very simple kind of semiotic example. Now, this has traditionally been done by human beings, expert practitioners who really kind of curate small amounts of communication or stimulus very deeply using cultural expertise. Now, our philosophy is, well, you know, with all of the wonderful computing power and models available today, why can't we start to think about doing that at scale? And by scale, I mean not just a few tens or a few hundred images, but tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands. What can we do to kind of automate that and build upon it? And as many of you will know, the trick in that context is getting machines to see like humans. So here we see some stones, some water, a leaf. But what does it actually mean to a human being? How would they respond to it, do you think? How would you respond to it? What would you say about it? Pardon? Yoga studio. Well, that's a common enough response, I would argue, but it means for most people things like calmness, naturalness, okay, peace. And this maze is not just a maze, it signifies complexity and confusion and difficulty. So that's our kind of secret sauce, if you like, to take imagery and actually extract these kind of universal meanings from it, disregarding essentially the fact that it's still a picture of a maze or it's still some stones and a rock. And to do that at scale. So we use our machine learning models to extract not only image descriptors like tags, but also adjectives. Obviously, color becomes important. Composition, complexity becomes important. And what we call the semiotic and emotional energies behind an image. So hedonism or nurture. And then a step deeper, what are the, for example, Jungian archetypes that are communicated by an image? These Jungian archetypes are very common in the world of marketing and advertising. They're used, you know, a lot for brands, right? So it's important, even if you don't necessarily believe in them, to be able to reflect them back to brands and say, well, you want to be an explorer? There you go. This is the sort of thing you've got to do. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a picture of how we work. And a very specific example. So we all know Twitter recently rebranded to X. Does anybody actually X? I don't think they do. We still tweet, right? We don't X. But feeding these simple logos through our platform and our model gives us a picture of what they represent. So the old bird, positive more than negative. Fun, self-expression, enjoyment, liberation. The new X seems to connote threat and vulnerability and isolation and danger. And these are real metrics, okay, which get a score for whatever you feed into it. Now, somebody, when I showed this to him, said, oh, well, it's about the X, isn't it? It's just about the X. Well, au contraire, because if you compare that with the Xbox logo, you get a completely different picture of the signifiers. Very, very different. So there's something going on here which is more about the fact, less about the fact there's an X, but more about how it is presented and executed. And in terms of those archetypes that I mentioned, You'll see Twitter is more of an explorer. It's about curiosity, self-expression, independence. Xbox is an everyman. It's a creator kind of archetype. And the new X, the new Twitter, suddenly has become a kind of ruler archetype. It's all about power. Does that make sense? Does that resonate, do you think? So it's all true. Well, this machine of ours actually does true things. Well, what I really wanted to talk to you about, now I've got that discussion sorted, is what we've been doing with Pinterest. So Pinterest is a very visual platform, and they commissioned us to do a really quite a big project, which was essentially about how they encourage the creators on Pinterest to obey the rules, right? And obeying the rules in the world of Pinterest is, how do we become more inspiring? They want to own the idea of inspiration on the internet. They want to be the place where people go for inspiration, okay? And at the same time, loads of their creators, who are essentially advertisers more often than not, who are making the money, are posting this absolute horror show of images, right? It's just not good enough for Pinterest. So they commissioned us with this brief. How do we actually understand and define what properties of pins are going to engage people more? Are they going to respond more positively to certain types of images? Now, we had 3 types of data here, right? So there is data in this presentation. It's not just, nonsense. We have the image properties, in other words, what we're reading out of these images, and it's a lot of pins, believe me, a lot of pins, very, very varied. What are we reading out of these images? Intersecting with a really big piece of market research where these pins are being fielded to people, and people are being asked to rate them on various properties like visual appeal or how inspiring looking that image is. Okay. Then the third element is behavioral. How in platform are people responding to these pins? Are they saving them more? Are they clicking through more? Right. So an intersection of 3 very interesting bits of data to allow us to build this. So we went through a process of essentially, cutting a long story short, analyzing all of this, building a model to test on pins that had not been evaluated by human beings, and to see how all that stacked up to give creative guidance. So, a few phases to this. So phase 1, and this is quite a good mechanism for analyzing images, is to start to think about clustering them according to archetypes. So, there could be an explorer cluster of images representing different elements of explorer, or there could be a caregiver cluster representing manifestations of those softer codes. And what we found at that very high level, there are certain types of imagery, and we'll get into this in a minute, that not only were rated very highly, so by top 2 box, I mean, 4 or 5 out of 5, okay, but also were more engaged with in the platform. So you can see a really quite an interesting correlation of those clusters with 2 distinct metrics. Metric 1, consumer ratings. Metric 2, how engaged are they within the platform with that pin? Interesting. Sure. Oh, okay. Yeah, is that better? Is that your live streaming thing? Okay, so that's all right. Where were we? What does a cluster analysis look like? Okay, so this is one for the data visualization people. So once we've run these analyses, we put it through the dashboard, and you can start to see these clusters of meaning emerging from all of that visual data. So to give you an idea, you can get structures here, you can start to build mood boards, start to visualize a very big complex visual data set. So if I then drill into a couple of these clusters, you can isolate them and then start to bring out examples. You can see themes starting to emerge. So there's a theme here about, the great outdoors, relaxation, enjoyment. There's a more physical theme over there, but both could be well received by different audiences. So to pull up a more detailed set of images here, you can see this cluster is, sharing a lot of codes of nature, relaxation, etc. So it's got a certain energy about it, hasn't it? And you can see that then come through these various metrics like hedonism, as I mentioned, the explorer code, indulgence, relaxation, quantitative metrics of what these images mean. Similarly, this one's more about power. It's more of a hero archetype, putting in courage and well-being. So once we've got all that data, we can start to think about how those things interrelate with what people actually think and what people actually do as a result. So from the research, we ended up with circa 220,000 individual ratings of various pins, these archetypal images. We already have now the visual metrics that we've extracted from those pins. So the goal is basically to say, well, take that data, how predictive can we be of people's attitudes to those images based on the properties of those images? So fairly typical modeling process. Dependent variable is how we would rate those images. Independent variables, all of the image properties like colors and archetypes and all those good things. So would it work? Good question. So having been through all that, we did a couple of things. Now this is a multinational study, and what we found is that certain markets like Brazil were just more positive in general about the things we were presenting them to them. And places like Japan were more negative or reserved in general. So we had to adjust for that a little bit. But what you see here is every pin adjusted for market differences according to the top quartile in blue for the positivity ratings, and the bottom quartile in yellow, and then a couple of quartiles in the middle. Okay, so first pass on the model, hurrah! Top quartile, bottom quartile. Really, really predictive of what were perceived as very good images or very poor images. Kind of good result, right? However, this middle bit, as is so common in modeling, is just a big mess, isn't it? So it's only barely better than, guessing, to be perfectly honest with you. So that led us down another path, which is to say, well, okay, we've got these different categories of pin, right, within the data. So it might be food and drink, or weddings, or home decor. Okay, which ones can we prioritize to really dig into at a category level? What's most interesting is Pinterest. So they decided that food and drink, women's fashion, and home decor were their most important sectors. By most important, it means they make them the most money, right? So Pinterest is not all altruism. They want to make money. We all want to make money. So long story short, we then ended up reducing that data set down to segmented categories so that we could actually start to build a model that's specific to food and drink, for example. And you can see that immediately is improved, albeit on a smaller data set. And you can see and visualize the things that are much more important, much more inspiring within that category versus these other things. And this anchors very much in a caregiver kind of archetype. And again, a sense of joy. These are the kind of sorts of metrics that underpin this. Home decor, similar story. Much more aspirational. So that's one of the metrics, aspiration, versus things that are actually quite mundane or quite strange, right? So underpinning this somewhere behind the hood, it is deciding that the properties of these types of images are simply less inspiring than these. And looking at it as a human being, maybe you agree. I kind of do. And with women's fashion, it's a less clear picture because more things about individual taste and trend style come into play, but lover archetypes, glamour, indulgence, rather than this kind of slightly isolated and distracted modality down the bottom left. So that sharpened it up quite a lot. And this was the end result. different models for different sectors, essentially different cluster types of images, operating at a reasonably high degree of reliability. We think. Remember, this is based on the research sample, okay? So what did we do then? Basically, take those models and deploy them on basket samples of 20,000 pins that had not been evaluated by human beings at all, okay? But did have the metadata of pin performance. In other words, how often they were saved, how often they were clicked through, etc., etc. And even because commercial project, they're all advertisers, they're paying to promote their pins, what actually is the return on investment and how does that intersect with these visual properties? So you can see a few of the top scoring pins there for food and drink, home decor. To cut a long story short, as we like to do, there's various behavioral metrics sitting on the platform. And once we've converted those scores into a 1 to 10 scale, okay, literally say bottom ones score 1, top ones score 10, everything in between, okay, you can start to bucket up the performance metrics. So in that context, draw your attention to the big blue line here, okay, and that big blue line is saves. In other words, people looking at a pin and saving it, which is basically the equivalent of an Instagram like in the Pinterest context. It's a really important measure for them. And you can see that line going up quite markedly against the average pin in the category as the inspiration score rises. And this is a predicted inspiration score. Okay, it's from our model. It's got nothing to do with human beings evaluating it anymore. That's a pure machine generated score. Same story for food and drink over there with a quite annoying blip at the end, but you know, we have to live with that, don't we, in the world of data? Not everything's perfect. Equally importantly, this grey line here is what they call hides. And this is when you're presented with a pin on the platform and you go, ugh, I hate that pin. And you can hide it, okay? And you can see the hides going down at each stage. And then finally, cost per 1,000. Remember, these are promoted pins a lot of the time. That's the little green line, okay? And in general terms, that also declines as the inspiration score increases. So the literal money shot for advertisers from this analysis is that by deploying these predictive models, okay, to essentially estimate how inspiring, how visually appealing, how good a pin is, actually markedly increases the amount of engagement per dollar. So they can put that in front of their advertisers and say, well, you know what, this is not just a hunch, okay? If you do these sorts of things, you will actually benefit financially. And that's now gone out to influence pretty much the whole of the advertiser content strategy within Pinterest. Now, to translate that a little bit, we then had to say, okay, enough hard data already. We'll translate that into kind of creative guidance for people who are quite creative. And then you have to kind of talk a different language, really. So, you know, develop essentially a playbook of what works, good examples, what doesn't work, you know, bad examples there. And also then translate that into things that might work across different categories. So we created a kind of an archetype called the joy giver, who's the kind of, you know, your friendly inspirer, if you like, for many audiences. And you can see how that runs across different categories like women's fashion, home decor, food and drink. But other archetypes are available as well, particularly in women's fashion. And that's one of the things we really had to unpick to accommodate this difference in kind of taste and presentation and trend. But at its most basic level, for example, yeah, really specific thing, all these social media platforms, and Pinterest no different, are awash with clickbait. And interesting that this emerged as a very specific cluster of images which contained lots of different images, right? Quite complex, okay? And the model gave it very low scores, which is kind of interesting because the individual images might actually share properties with other pins, but it's the combination and the complexity of that kind of clickbait category that made the difference. and what they get is very low saves. Yeah, people click on them because it's clickbait, it's literally clickbait, but they don't save them. So a clear bit of creative guidance to paid advertisers, and these are all paid adverts, right, is don't look like clickbait. You know, it may seem obvious in design terms, right, but there's so much of this stuff out there on Pinterest, and it's pretty clear that the algorithm says this is not going to work for you. So really clear, simple bit of creative guidance. Things that run across categories, again, you see. So, you know, reading a metric like how much text is occupying this image is quite important, actually. So you can overdo that. Too much text, too much text, too much text. Just enough text to keep the interest value going. And, you know, there's a case for simplicity, but not oversimplicity, if you see what I mean. You have to, in design terms, give people a bit of context for what you're advertising. So there's some very specific examples of how it's worked, and it has worked very well for them, and it's improved the quality of the paid ads. I'm not suggesting it's necessarily improved the quality of consumer pins, because people will pin what they want, but from the advertising point of view, it's improved the Pinterest case to receive advertising revenues, and it's improved the quality of their content. So what's next? Well, I kind of wanted to touch on generative AI, partly because it's really interesting and we're using it a lot as well, but partly because it's kind of now starting to swish out there into the world of Pinterest and Instagram and so on and so forth. And, you know, frankly, looking at some of this stuff, you'd struggle to identify it as an AI image, wouldn't you? I mean, it really is starting to get that good. Now, what's quite interesting here is that there's a built-in kind of positivity to the OpenAI models particularly, which means that they will generate things that they believe represent or speak to positive human emotions, okay, rather like that inspiration index that we built. And what's interesting here is a lot of these images, and there's loads of these, we've got loads of these, they kind of correspond to the things that people liked best in the survey. Again, could be quite obvious, right? But ask yourself why Lloyds Bank is the most consistently highly rated advertiser amongst the banks. No offense, Barclays, but it is. It's the horses, guys. And similarly, stick a puppy in an advert, you know you're going to get good results. Okay, super simple stuff. But it's interesting the way that it's these generative AIs are generating a certain type of content. But not always. We've come across some wonderful examples, actually, as we've been through our generative AI journey. And just in response to really simple prompts, right? I was doing a report about trends in wine-based cocktails. I wanted an image to represent it. Generate an analysis of trends in wine-based cocktails, and you get a slightly drunken analyst looking at some PowerPoint charts. I want a metaphor for innocence. On the good side, we get, you know, rather nice, actually childlike depiction. On the left, we get a kind of dismembered set of babies and dolls. So at some level, it kind of is recognizing that there is an element of innocence here, but it's slightly gone off the rails, right? These kind of hallucinations are still quite rife. A person wearing bunny ears. That's a nice, sweet image, isn't it? This one looks like Salvador Dali, doesn't it? Even a simple prompt like two people drinking and laughing together in a bar can give you anything between normal people and dangerous lunatics. And last but not least, we talked about animals, didn't we? A cat stretching. And this is my favorite. This is a project we did with Weber. Grilling with loved ones, ladies and gentlemen. And at some level, behind the scenes, it's just obviously thinking barbecue, grilling, hot dog, you know. So it's kind of giving you what you asked for in a really, truly horrible way. Anyway, I'm kind of going a bit off topic here, but just back to Pinterest, a few interesting points here. So they're all about inspiration. Okay, it's never been measured properly before. It's interesting that we can measure and actually predict now likely visual appeal of these things. Even more interesting is that it has a strong relationship with real commercial outcomes, and that it can be translated into real creative guidance. And interesting but warning signal is because a lot of the generative AIs follow the same embedded logic. Okay, what we're going to see and what we're already seeing is an issue, I think, within the content that's generated on these platforms, unless things are absolutely clearly labeled as AI made, right? And we've seen the quality of the stuff that these models can produce. Unless they're clearly labeled as AI made, what does that mean for the inspiringness of Pinterest if it's being inundated by essentially fake inspiring images? To be discussed, but it's something they're worried about because ultimately they want to be all about authenticity. Well, I hope you found that interesting, guys. I'm done. Thank you.